Here we are. I have been at this all day. Listen, new podcaster woes. I am going to essentially read from my notes. I was really trying not to do that. I have not committed everything to memory. And to be honest with you, there's just so much, and I want to make sure that I cover everything. I don't want to miss a beat. And I hope that you just roll with me on this one. For this episode, I really want to start with this word that I keep coming back to, diaspora. It comes from the Greek diaspero, meaning to sow over, to scatter, or to spread seeds across land that you didn't choose. And for centuries, this word has belonged to people, to the displaced, the uprooted, the ones who carry memory in their bodies, because home was no longer a place that they could stand on. But what if I told you that your data lives a diasporic life too? Not that it might or that it could, but that it actually does. Think about every search you run, every voice note you send, or route that you drive that you got from GPS, the symptoms that you type into your browser at 2 o'clock in the morning because you really want to know what's up. Like all of that is data. And the moment it leaves your fingertips, though, it's gone. It's moving and crossing borders you'll never get to see. It's also translated into languages you don't speak. And I'm not talking about, the world's languages, different populations, different communities. I'm talking about the languages of algorithms, of training sets, of prediction models. It's fragmented, but it's also claimed and it's putting in some work. The diaspora piece, though, is that it actually never comes home. I want to welcome you back to Data Diasporas. My name is Melissa, and today we're unboxing data. So let's start with what is data, anyways? I'm not going to give you the textbook answer. I really don't think that's what you came here for. And surely, if you want that, it's out there. Do a search on structured or unstructured data, qualitative data, metadata, big data, small data, red data, blue data. It's all out there. There's hundreds of definitions in hundreds of places. But that's not how data is showing up in your life. Data shows up when your name is getting auto-corrected to something it's actually not, or when an algorithm decides what news you're going to see before breakfast. When a zip code determines your interest rate or your accent gets flagged just because the voice recognition system wasn't trained on anybody who sounds like you. Data is the digital footprints of a lived life. It's what's being left behind as you're moving through the world, and also the world is watching. So here's what I want you to sit with, right? In modern life, you are being broken down into data points every single day. We all are, right? And from those points, whether it's from machines or institutions or governments or corporations, like the systems actually believe that they know you. They believe they can predict what you're going to buy, how you're going to vote, whether you're going to be a risk or an opportunity. But the thing is that those data points are just fragments. They're pieces of information that's pulled out of context. They're your great grandmother's recipe for sweetbread without the story of how your dad would skip going to church so that he could grate coconut for her to make them, or the reason why she made them in the first place. They're your health record, right? But without the prayer that was said before the appointment. That ad that pops up because of something in the background of a friend's photo, even though you didn't search for it, that window is how your data is moving. Welcome to Data Diasporas, y'all. Data is really powerful, but it's incomplete. And the danger isn't just that it's incomplete, it's that the people holding it don't know what's missing, Or worse, they don't even care. So when I say data, I want you to hear something bigger than numbers. I want you to hear the digital trace of who you are that's being captured by systems you don't know anything about, you didn't have any hand in designing them. And it's traveling routes that you didn't choose, arriving at destinations you weren't going to, maybe not even invited to. That's data, and that's where our story is going to begin. Now, if you've been with me from the beginning, from our first episode, Nothing About Us Without Us, you know that I'm drawing a line between history and technology, between colonial systems and digital systems, not because they're identical, but because there's a logic that's running parallel. In many cases, also, it's really similar, if not the same. So let me explain a little bit what I mean by that. Because when I first started developing the ideas behind data diasporas, I kept returning in my mind to this idea of the triangular trade, right? Like the transatlantic slave system that connected Europe, the African continent, and the Americas through its stolen and violent extraction of people from the African continent, the creation of labor, if you will, and then the extraction of raw materials from land to be manufactured, produced, and resold elsewhere. I've since started working with more AI tools and agents that I'm designing to help me organize my ideas. When I engaged with one, it referred me to some scholars that I myself need to familiarize myself with, but I'm going to drop some here so that when we come back to them, we'll know, we'll have this reference point. Scholars like Nick Coldry, Ulysses Mejias, and Danielle Coleman, who've actually drawn direct parallels between that history and today's digital economy. Coldry and Mejias call it data colonialism, the idea that we're living through this new era of extraction, where what's being taken isn't land or labor, but it's life itself, being converted into data and claimed as like this raw material, right? Because I feel like this is an example we can all likely wrap our minds around. Um, I'm not going to dive into it deeper here, other than to say I do have some personal theories on why I believe this idea of data colonialism is so important for some of today's justice movements. Now, if you've studied history, even if you haven't, you've probably heard of the triangular trade, right? It's one of those concepts that gets taught in this really like neat, tidy way, wrapped in, beautified with a bow. Europe sends these manufactured goods to Africa, right? But it started with enslaved people being taken from Africa to the Americas. And these raw materials, whether it be sugar or cotton or tobacco, are flown back to Europe. But that sounds real clean, real closed, right? There's just 3 points. The thing is, the more you dig into the actual history, the messier that you know that it gets, right? And this so-called triangle was really a simplification just to be able to teach about enslavement. It's not a truth. There's rarely any completed, like, full triangular route that individual ships were making. They were actually multinodal, right? They were going from here to there to all over, involving dozens of ports, hundreds of people involved in relationships that were far more tangled and intertwined than any sort of like three-sided shape. More importantly, and this is the part that often gets erased, the people, right? The people at every point of this system were not passive. They were traders, they were resistors, innovators, survivors. They had agency. They were creating and building along the way. The triangle idea really flattens that. It turns something that's really complex and human into just kind of like these arrows on the map. So when I think about data and trying to map it, where I was at first was we have extraction of data being collected from communities, and then there's some processing that's happening somewhere else through these algorithms. The profit, though, is being captured by these platforms and institutions that have nothing to do with the communities. That mapping is real and also still more complex than a three-sided triangle. But the more I sat with it, the more something just didn't feel right. And I wanted to know a little bit more about um, what was really bothering me here. And it has to do, again, with the fact that people caught in this system are not passive, right? Um, I had an opportunity to read Paul Gilroy's Black Atlantic, and he took this idea of the triangular trade, the triangle of the slave trade, and really just kind of exploded it. He was saying like the real story isn't in the points. It's actually in the routes, right? Like the movement that's happening between them, because the transformation is happening while in transit. That's where cultures are being born, not at the origin or at the destination, but on the water in between. And he gave us new grammar, right? Not looking at like roots, like trees' roots in the ground, but these roots or the routes, right, that are happening in between these origin and destination points. So, not where you're coming from, but actually how it's moving, what people became through that movement, and who was in charge or trying to control, I should say, like the journey. For me, that's also where data diaspora lives, because it's not in a triangle either. It's moving through pipelines of servers and data centers and third-party brokers or APIs. It's crossing jurisdictions just like it's crossing continents. And it's being extracted, right, from one context, kind of stripped of its meaning, and being recombined with a million other fragments that are out there from who knows how many people, and being put to work in a place and in a way that has no relationship to where it started. That's the diaspora piece for me. And so I want to offer you this different framework, not looking at the data extraction triangle, if you will, but data routes and the pathways that your data is traveling, the transformation that it's undergoing, and the power dynamics that are determining who controls that journey. Because the question is never whether your data moves, right? Displacement is the default condition of data. But the question is who's governing the route? I want to say that a lot gets lost in translation and in transit, because this is where it gets really personal. Think about something that you've shared online, whether it's a photo of a family gathering or, the fact that you search for flights to a country you haven't been to in years. Each of those moments is carrying some meaning. It's carrying context, emotion, history, things that, if you think about it, once that data leaves you, like you kind of can question, like, what is happening to it? It's entering a system that doesn't actually know your story, but it's still getting categorized in a way and defined in a way, right? Whether it's your age bracket or an estimate of your income, your behavior patterns, like that photo becomes a data point that could be fed into facial recognition or location tracking. Your health search becomes some sort of signal or part of a predictive model for insurance risk. The system doesn't just forget who you are, it actually decides who you are and replaces your context with its own categories to try to make sense of it in its own way, treating those categories as though they're the truth, not you. Scholars in this space describe this as a creation of new data relations, where everyday life is getting converted into streams of information that's being captured and then also that's being commodified. But I think that language itself, while it's accurate, still is missing something, right? Like it's missing the language and the understanding of the violence of what's happening during this mistranslation. Because when your data is stripped of its context and reassembled by an algorithm somewhere, it's not just extraction, it's actually a form of misrepresentation. It's someone telling you your story in a language that they invented to people they believe that information is important to, but it's not necessarily for a purpose that serves you. And for communities that have already experienced this misrepresentation, communities whose histories have been told by others or whose identity have been defined from outside of them, this isn't abstract. It's very familiar. And that's why data diasporas for me isn't just about technology. It's about one of the oldest questions that diasporic communities themselves have faced, right? Like, who gets to define us or tell our story? And what's happening when that version of us is circulating in a world, but it's not one that we actually recognize? Some of us may be physically living in our birthplace or our hometowns, but digitally, if we think about it, we're all experiencing lives as diasporic people. So, what do we do? Right? Like, I've been wrestling with this question, and I want to be honest with you about where I've landed and where there's things that I'm still working out. I'm not a coder, but I am learning about AI, and I believe it's important. And it's important for me to think of it more than just a tool of technology because it really is a social construct and it's our culture. As someone who has a business and an anthropology sociology background, I'm learning both not only for like my professional career, but also for my curiosities. When I entered this information into one of the AI platforms, it was like, oh, you should start this conversation by talking about data return. And was really thinking about it, mulling it over, right? The parallel or like the comparison that it came back with was, like museums that are returning stolen artifacts to their communities of origin. And that's a hugely powerful image. Don't get me wrong, but the more that I thought about it, it didn't make sense. It didn't make sense. Like if this is not a sculpture that we're talking about. Data does not work that way as like a stolen artifact, right? Once your the health patterns of your community have been aggregated with a million other data points and used to train a prediction model, there's nothing really discrete that you can hand back. You can't untrain an algorithm. That data has been transformed. And so pretending that we can reverse it, I think, is really a false hope. So I've landed somewhere really different. It's not about the return, but I really want to focus on the relationship. And this really applies to both scenarios when you think about it in this way. In human diasporas, one of the most powerful things isn't always about homecoming because sometimes people can't go back. Sometimes, I would say most times, right, home doesn't even exist the way it's used to. If you even consider the theory of imagined memory, no home exists the same way we remember it. But what does persist across distance and what we hold on to are the relationships, right? It's the cultural exchange, the phone calls. If you're like me, you remember back when international calls on Sundays were cheaper or they were free. So you were only talking to family members in other countries on those days. Um, but still to this day, we and I'm talking about the home phone, right? Like the rotary phone. Never mind. But some of the things that still kind of help us to maintain relationships are remittances, maintaining political solidarity with with what's going on in the governments back home, there's always going to be knowledge and wisdom that is flowing backwards and forwards, even when people can't. I believe data can work the same way. So the goal isn't to undo displacement. It's to ensure that communities remain in relationship with their data after it leaves. So you might be asking, what does that actually look like in practice? Here are three things that I've thought of. You might have more, and I invite you to, comment below on what this looks like in practice for you. First, though, I think about the story that we tell, right? Like we have an opportunity and we must really change this metaphor. Right now, the dominant framework is that tech is built on data and data is oil. Like this beautiful natural resource that has to be discovered and unearthed, and then extracted and refined. That's not what data is. Data's culture, if you ask me, right? It's identity. It's the digital expression of our lived experience. And when we try to treat it as a commodity, we erase the people who generate it. So the first intervention I feel like is in the narrative, right? Like let's reject that metaphor of extraction and let's insist that data is carrying the weight of the life of whom it came from. Secondly, looking in practice is the policies that we're going to demand, right? Consent, as it currently works, is pure theater, right? How many times have you clicked I agree on a terms of service document and knowing that it's designed to be unreadable? I'm not even saying you didn't try to read it. I'm saying you tried and you realized like, oh, they are legitimately just trying to confuse me, right? That's not agency. It's a performance of agency. And so real governance means communities have the power to define the conditions under which their data travels. Where's the data going? Who gets to use it? And what comes back to this community as a result? There are models for this. And to be fair with you, I still need to dig deeper into those models. Some of the ones that came up early in my research were developed by the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, who has a framework for data governance that's rooted in self-determination. Canada's First Nations looks at ownership, control, access, and possession. Like these aren't theoretical, they're actually operational. And they can be adapted for this data diaspora conversation. Thirdly, in practice, we need to look at the structures that we build. If we think of it like a credit union, but just for data, we can see how pooling collective information and governing democratically around what happens to that data and the value it generates can actually flow back to the community. Although a DAO isn't a data cooperative in that sense, I really feel like that's a similar structure or approach that comes to mind when I'm thinking about that. I was also privileged to be a founding member of an organization called Heirloom, and I hope to have the visionaries Angela Benton and Larry Lewis on the podcast one day to talk about data cooperatives and community-owned organizations where members collectively get to decide how their data is used and who benefits from it. That's kind of the horizon that I'm pointing toward. Not a world where data stays home. And I mean, that's not even possible. And at this point, we might not even want that, right? But if we can imagine a world where data travels with our values attached to them, where the relationship between you and your data just doesn't end because you've clicked post or you've closed the app. I really want us to imagine where the communities that are generating the richest and the most human, most culturally specific data in the world are the ones who get to govern it and interpret what it means and then ultimately benefit from it. So before I close, I want to leave you with something to carry. We started today by asking what is data, and I hope the response and some of what I've shared has inspired you to kind of hold now something bigger than the definition that you came in with. Because data really isn't just information. It is looking at our livelihoods in a digital form. You probably notice by now that I've been drawing on song lyrics to add a bit of flavor to the titles. That's a bit of me being creative, and also me thinking about, this pattern of how life carries on through all of these different contexts that we're in and that we experience. And so the pattern of your movement through a city that you left long ago, it's still stored somewhere. Just like I drew on one of my favorite artists, Prince, for the title of this episode, Until the End of Time, because data doesn't expire. You think about that voice note that you deleted from your phone, it's may not be easily or readily available, but it's backed up somewhere on a server that you'll never see. The question, though, of who stewards it and who interprets this data and who profits from it, that's a question that extends also quite literally until the end of time. So here's what I'm asking of you. First, define data for yourself. Not the textbook definition, but your definition from your own experience. Like, what does data mean to you? What pieces of your life have become data without your permission? And you can write that down, drop it in the comments, share it on our website, because the moment that you name it, you really start to own it. Secondly, notice the routes. Like this week, pay attention to where your data goes. Read one of the terms of service agreement that you're clicking yes to. Look at the permissions of an app that you're in and ask yourself, like, who's holding on to this and what are they doing with it? Do I actually agree with these terms of service, or am I just clicking a button? Thirdly, I'm going to ask you to stay with me. I know this was a long one and it was, just kind of me narrating, but I believe what we started today is just the beginning. In coming episodes, I want us to map some of those data routes in detail, right? Meet some of the people who are building alternatives, who are building the cooperatives and the sovereign systems and community-owned tools. And let's keep asking the question that sits at the heart of everything we do. Who gets to tell our story? This is Data Diasporas, y'all, and I'm so glad you're here.